The hardware store had been closed for 6 years, but I still drove past it every Tuesday, like the lights might come back on. That was where it started, I think. Not the betrayal. The habit. I built my whole life on the kind of habit that looks like love from the outside and feels like obligation from the inside. And by the time I figured out the difference, I was 71 years old and standing in a marble lobby that I owned, being told I wasn't welcome upstairs. Let me back up. My name doesn't matter much for this, but I'll tell you anyway because my daughter spent 30 years acting like it embarrassed her. Roland. Roland Aldous Mercer. My father ran a hardware store in Akron, Ohio, the kind with the wood floors that groaned and a cat that lived in the paint aisle, and I worked that register from the time I was 9. I learned everything I know about people behind that counter. You can tell a lot about a man by how he treats you when he needs a quarter-inch bolt, and you're out of the size he wants. I didn't stay in hardware. I went into commercial real estate in the late 70s when downtown was dying and nobody wanted the old buildings. I bought them anyway, bought them for the price of the back taxes, fixed the boilers myself, rented to dentists and accountants, and a tax office that's still there. By the time I was 50, I owned 11 buildings across 3 counties, and I never once told anybody, because the second people know you have money, they stop seeing you and start seeing the money. My daughter saw the money early. I'll give her that. She was sharp. Her name is Delphine. My late wife picked it out of a French novel she loved, and I went along with it the way I went along with everything Carol wanted, because Carol was the warm one, and I was the wallet, and we both knew it, and it worked for 34 years, until the cancer took her in a single brutal autumn. Delphine was 19 when her mother died, old enough to grieve like an adult. She grieved like a businesswoman instead. 3 weeks after the funeral, she asked me very gently if I'd thought about what I was going to do with the house now that it was too big for one person. I should have heard it. I didn't. I told myself she was scared. I told myself a lot of things over the next 30 years. I paid for her college, then her master's because the bachelor's wasn't getting her anywhere. Then a condo in Columbus because renting was throwing money away, which is a thing people say when they want you to buy them something. Then a car, then a better car, then the down payment on a house when she married a man named Preston who sold financial products I never fully understood and who shook my hand like he was testing the firmness of a melon. I want to be fair to Preston. He wasn't cruel. He was worse than cruel. He was indifferent in a way that wore the costume of politeness. He'd call me Pops and never once ask how I was, and he'd let Delphine do all the asking for money so his own hands stayed clean. Smart that. I've negotiated against a lot of men in my life, and I know a guy who let somebody else hold the knife. For a long time, I didn't mind. That's the part I'm ashamed of. I liked being needed. After Carol died, the phone calls asking for money were the only phone calls I got, and a man will pay a steep price to keep his phone ringing. $5,000 here, $12,000 there. A roof. A boat. One summer, God help me. A boat. I told myself I was building something for my grandkids. There were 2 of them, a boy and a girl. Hayes and a little one they called Wren, and I loved those kids in a way that frightened me, because loving them was the only thing in my life that didn't have a transaction stapled to it. I'd drive 90 minutes to watch Hayes lose a soccer game and feel like a millionaire, which technically I already was, but you know what I mean, the realer kind. So when Delphine called me on a Thursday in March and said she and Preston wanted to invest in something meaningful as a family, I should have been suspicious. I wasn't. I was happy. Happy is the most expensive feeling there is. The something meaningful was a building. Of course it was. There was a property in the Short North District, a converted warehouse, 8 high-end units, and the top floor was a penthouse with windows that looked out over the whole city. Delphine had it all worked out. They'd live in the penthouse. They'd rent the other units. The rental income would cover the mortgage, and over time the building would be the family legacy, passed down, our name on something permanent. She used the word name 4 times in that phone call. She knew exactly which string to pull. Here's where I made my mistake, and I want to be honest about it because the whole point of telling you this is so you don't make the same one. I didn't buy the building for them. I bought the building. Me, through one of my holding companies, the same way I'd bought everything for 40 years, because old habits and good lawyers don't quit. The deed never had their names on it. Not because I was scheming, because that's just how I did things quietly, in the background, the man behind the counter handing over the bolt. I let Delphine and Preston believe what they wanted to believe, which is that it was theirs, and they leased the penthouse from the holding company for a number that was, frankly, a joke. $2,000 a month for $4 million of real estate. A gift dressed up as a transaction so it would feel dignified. I figured I'd transfer it to them properly someday. When they'd earned it, I kept waiting for the someday. They moved in that summer. Threw a party I wasn't invited to, which stung. But Delphine said it was just work people. You'd be bored, Dad. And I believed her because believing her was easier than the alternative. I sent a case of good wine. Preston texted back a thumbs up. Not even words. A thumbs up. The grandkids stopped coming around as much. Delphine said they were busy with activities. I'd call and Hayes would be polite for 90 seconds, and then somebody in the background would say something and he'd have to go. I told myself teenagers are like that. He wasn't a teenager. He was 11. Now here's the thing I need you to understand about that whole stretch of years, because it matters for what comes next. I was lonely in a way I couldn't admit to anybody, least of all myself. Carol had been gone a decade. My brother and I weren't speaking for reasons I'll get to. And I had organized my entire emotional life around the daughter who only ever called me when a number was involved. I knew it. I knew it the way you know a tooth is going bad before you'll go to the dentist. You run your tongue over it and you wince and you keep eating on the other side. The wedding was the thing that finally made me go to the dentist, so to speak. Not Delphine's wedding. Hayes's. My grandson got married and I found out from a checkout girl at the grocery store. Let me tell you exactly how it happened, because I've replayed it 1,000 times and it still doesn't feel real. I was buying groceries at the Kroger on a Saturday, the one near my house, and the young woman ringing me up, couldn't have been more than 20 feet, looked at my last name on the card and lit up. "Mercer," she said. "Are you related to Hayes? He and Leela just got married. It was so beautiful I went to high school with her." And she kept talking about the flowers, about how the bride cried, about how the groom's whole family flew in, and I stood there with my debit card in the little machine in the screen, asking me if I wanted cash back, and I said, no, no cash back, and I drove home, and I sat in my truck in the driveway for 40 minutes. My grandson was old enough to get married. I had missed it entirely. I hadn't even known he had a girlfriend. I called Delphine. I tried to keep my voice level, the way I'd kept it level across 1,000 negotiations. "I just heard Hayes got married." There was a pause. I know pauses. I've used pauses to close deals. This was the pause of somebody deciding how much truth to spend. Oh, Dad, it was small. Tiny. Just immediate family. We didn't want to make a fuss. I'm immediate family. Dad, it was complicated. Leela's parents are very particular about things, and it was easier. You understand, there wasn't even really a guest list. I found out later there were 180 guests. 180. At a venue I would later learn cost more than my first house, with a band and a raw bar, and a champagne tower, and a string of those big paper lanterns that Carol always loved, the kind she'd point out at other people's weddings and say, "Someday, for one of ours." My grandson got married under the exact lanterns my late wife had dreamed about, and the only reason I know is the photographer posted them online, tagged the venue, and the internet doesn't keep secrets the way families do. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to make this about my hurt feelings, and an old man's hurt feelings are not interesting. What got me was simpler and colder than hurt. It was the math. I had paid for that venue, not directly. But I'd been transferring money to Delphine for the kid's future for 3 years, money she swore was going into a college fund. There was no college fund. There was a wedding fund. My money, my grandson's wedding. And I wasn't allowed to come because Lila's parents were particular, which I eventually understood meant I didn't look the part. I drive a 15-year-old pickup. I wear the same 4 flannel shirts. I keep my money where nobody can see it, which is exactly how I kept it for 40 years. And somewhere along the line, my own family decided that made me an embarrassment instead of the reason they had anything at all. That was the tooth finally cracking. I didn't do anything right away. People expect the explosion, and I get why. But that's not how a man builds 11 buildings. You don't explode. You assess. I spent 2 weeks just looking at things. Bank statements, the lease agreements, The transfer records. Every wire I'd sent for 30 years, which I'd kept, because the kid behind the hardware counter never throws away a receipt. And I sat with my coffee at the kitchen table every morning, the chair across from me empty where Carol used to sit, and I added it all up. $2.4 million. That's what I'd given Delphine and Preston over 30 years, not counting the building. 2.4 million, and I had never once been thanked in a way that wasn't immediately followed by another ask. I'm not exaggerating that. I went through every birthday card. Every thank you was the bread of a sandwich, and the meat was always, and also, we were wondering. So I made a decision the way I've made every important decision in my life, which is quietly and completely, and without telling anyone until it was done. I called my attorney, good woman, sharp as a tack, been with me 20 years. I told her I wanted to do 3 things. I wanted to stop all recurring transfers, effective immediately. I wanted to revisit the lease on the penthouse, which was up for renewal, and adjust it to market rate. And I wanted her to draft a new will. Market rate on that penthouse, by the way, was $11,000 a month. I didn't do it out of cruelty. I want that on the record. I did it because for 30 years I've been confusing money with love, and I had finally, expensively, learned the difference. And I figured the kindest thing I could do, for me, for the grandkids, maybe even for Delphine someday, was to stop being the wallet and find out if there was a father in there anybody actually wanted. The new lease went out in April. Market rate, 60 days notice, all very legal, all very polite. From the property management company, which was me, but they didn't know that. I'd never told them I owned it. They thought some faceless corporation was their landlord, and that dear old dad just helped with the payments out of the goodness of his heart. For 3 weeks, nothing. I think Preston was trying to figure out the angle. A man like Preston always assumes there's an angle, because he always has one. Then Delphine called. It was a Tuesday. I was, of all things, driving past the old hardware store, doing my little ritual, when the phone rang through the truck speakers. Her voice was tight in a way I recognized from childhood, the voice she used when she'd done something and needed it fixed before her mother found out. Dad, there's a problem with the building. The rent's gone insane. Some corporate thing, they jacked it to $11,000. It has to be a mistake. Can you call them? You know people. And I want you to understand, there was a version of this where I just fixed it, where I called my own company and quietly lowered it back down and never said a word, and kept the phone ringing. That version was right there. I could feel it, the old reflex, the muscle memory of 3 decades of being needed. I pulled the truck over in front of the hardware store, put it in park, looked at the dark windows where the cat used to sleep. When was the wedding? I asked her. The pause again, longer this time. What? Hayes's wedding. When was it? What day? Dad, what does that have to do with the rent? It was a few weeks ago, I don't see. A few weeks ago, I don't see. A few weeks ago. I don't see. A few weeks ago. And you called me about Hayes's college fund in February, and I sent $40,000 in February. For college. For a boy who'd already proposed. Silence. The good kind, for me. The kind where the other person realizes the floor isn't where they thought it was. Dad, I'm not going to call about the rent, I said. There's no mistake. The rent is $11,000 because that's what that penthouse is worth, and you should pay what something is worth. I taught Hayes that, or I tried to before you decided I wasn't suitable for weddings. Dad, that is not fair, Lila's parents. Lila's parents, I said, have never given that boy $1. I've given him a future. And I wasn't allowed at the wedding because of my truck. I heard Preston in the background. I heard him say, just hang up, let me handle the company. And something in me, something that had been asleep for 30 years behind a hardware counter, woke all the way up. Put me on speaker, I said. I want Preston to hear this too. She did. I could tell by the change in the sound. There is no company to handle, I said. I own the building. I've owned it since the day you invested in it as a family. I own the holding company that holds your lease. I am the faceless corporation. So when you raise the rent to market rate, you're not fighting some landlord. You're asking your father, the one you didn't invite to his own grandson's wedding, to subsidize your life by $9,000 a month, and I've decided not to. I have never heard a room go that quiet across a phone line. It was the quiet of 2 people doing math very fast and arriving at a number they did not like. You can't do that, Preston said finally. Calm. Always calm, that one. There are tenant protections. We'll get a lawyer. You should, I said. Get a good one. Have them look at the lease you signed. Then have them call Vivian Castellano, who has been my attorney for 20 years and who drafted that lease specifically, so this conversation would go exactly the way it's going. You have 60 days, Preston. The notice was legal, I made sure. And I hung up. Then I sat in my truck in front of my dead father's hardware store, and I shook. Not with regret. With something I didn't have a name for until later. It was the feeling of finally eating on the bad side of your mouth and finding out the tooth was already gone, and the gap didn't hurt, it just felt strange and new and clean. They didn't move out in 60 days, naturally. People like that never believe the gun is loaded until it goes off. There were lawyers. There were letters. Preston's attorney was good, but he was working with bad material, because Vivian had built that lease like one of my buildings. Foundation first, no shortcuts. There was a week where Delphine left me 11 voicemails escalating from sweet to furious to weeping, and I listened to every one of them sitting at that empty kitchen table, and I didn't call back, and Carol's chair stayed empty. And I missed my wife so much in those weeks that I could hardly breathe, because Carol would have known what to do with all of it. Carol could love somebody and still tell them no. I'd never learned the second part. I was learning it at 71, in voicemails, in the dark. The thing that broke the standoff wasn't the law. It was Hayes. My grandson called me. The first call I'd gotten from him, unprompted, in maybe 2 years. His voice had gotten deep, a man's voice, and it threw me. "Grandpa," he said, "is it true that you own the building, that you paid for? Mom said you paid for my wedding and you weren't there, and I didn't even— Grandpa, I didn't know. I swear to God I didn't know. And here's the part that I'll carry to my grave, the part that made all of it worth it. He was crying, not about the building, not about the money. He was crying because he'd gotten married, the biggest day of his young life, and his grandfather hadn't been there. And he'd been told some story about scheduling, and we'll have a separate dinner for you, Grandpa. And he believed it, because why wouldn't you believe your own parents? He'd looked for me at his wedding. He told me that. He kept looking at the door during the toasts, because some part of him couldn't believe I wouldn't come. I would have torn that venue apart with my hands to be there, I told him. Nobody asked me. Nobody told me. Your mother said Leela's parents wouldn't have wanted a man like me in the pictures. The silence from a 23-year-old is different from the silence of his scheming parents. It's the silence of a world rearranging itself, of a kid realizing the villain in the story he'd been told his whole life had been the only one telling him the truth. "Lila wants to meet you," he said finally, thick-voiced. "Her parents. Grandpa, her dad runs an HVAC business. He installs air conditioners. They're not particular about anything. Mom made all of that up. Of course she did. The particular in-laws who looked down on my truck were a tradesman and his wife from Dayton who'd have loved nothing more than to talk shop with a man who'd rewired boilers with his own hands. Delphine invented a whole class of people to be ashamed of me, because the real shame was hers, and she needed somewhere to put it. I let the penthouse thing run its course. They moved out eventually. Not evicted in the end, because I'm not a cruel man, and Hayes asked me not to make his mother a story people told. They moved to a perfectly nice house in a perfectly nice suburb that they could actually afford, which Preston had to start affording by selling things, including the boat. I confess I felt something unkind about the boat. I never gave Delphine another lump sum. Not one. The recurring transfers stayed off. When she finally came to see me, months later, no Preston, just her, at the kitchen table where her mother used to sit. She didn't apologize, not really. She said, "I don't understand why you'd embarrass us like this." And I looked at my daughter, 53 years old, who still thought the crime was that I'd stopped paying rather than what she'd done to earn the rent. And I understood that some people you cannot fix with money or with the absence of money, because money was never the disease, only the symptom. "I'm not embarrassing you," I said. "I'm just done pretending the bolt comes free." She didn't know what that meant. Carol would have. The hardware counter, the 1/4-inch bolt, the whole thing. Hayes and Lila have me over for dinner now, twice a month. She's a good one, that girl. She found a photo of Carol online from an old newspaper write-up and had it framed and put it on their mantle next to their own wedding pictures, because Hayes's grandmother should be at the wedding too, even if she couldn't be. I had to leave the room when she showed me. A man my age shouldn't cry in front of company. They're going to have a baby in the spring. They asked me to be there for the birth. First in line, Hayes said. Right up front. I'm changing the will again. Vivian thinks I'm fickle. I tell her I'm finally getting it right. The 11 buildings, the holding companies, all of it. It skips a generation now. Goes to Hayes and Wren in a trust, with conditions, with a board, with rules I learned the hard way. Delphine gets the house I grew up in, the one in Akron above, where the hardware store used to be, which is worth almost nothing and means almost everything, and a letter she won't understand. People ask me sometimes if I regret it. Cutting her off. Letting it get so cold between us. And I tell them the truth, which is the same truth the checkout girl at the Kroger handed me without knowing it, the one that cracked the bad tooth and let the air in. You can give a person everything and teach them nothing, or you can finally teach them the one thing that costs you the most, which is the word no, and live long enough to watch it grow into something you can be proud of. I still drive past the hardware store every Tuesday, but I don't sit there as long anymore. There's usually somewhere I'd rather be. For 30 years I thought I was loving my daughter, and what I was really doing was paying her to leave me alone. That's the hard thing I had to sit with at that empty kitchen table. Every wire I sent Delphine wasn't kindness. It was a man so afraid of being unwanted that he bought his own loneliness a nicer chair to sit in. Cause and effect is patient. You feed a child money instead of character. And 30 years later, she stands in a marble lobby that you own and tells you that you don't look right enough to attend your own grandson's wedding. I built that. Not Preston. Not Lila's invented particular parents. Me. The seed I planted with the very first check grew into exactly the tree you'd expect. What saved me wasn't being rich. I'd been rich the whole time it was happening. What finally turned things was learning to do the one thing. Money had always let me skip. I had to look squarely at what was true, even when the truth was that I'd raised a daughter who couldn't love a man who stopped paying. Seeing it clearly was harder than building 11 buildings, because you can't subcontract that kind of work to anybody else. And once I saw it, I had to do the right thing instead of the easy thing. And the right thing was a word I'd never learned to say to her. No, a small word. The most expensive one I ever spoke. But knowing what's true and knowing what's right don't mean a thing if you fold the first time somebody cries on the phone. Delphine left me 11 voicemails. I listened to everyone, sitting where Carol used to sit, missing my wife so badly I could hardly breathe, and I did not call back. Not because I'd gone cold, because I'd finally gotten strong enough to let someone be angry at me and survive it. That's the part nobody warns you about. Doing the right thing isn't a single brave moment. It's holding the line for 60 days while the person you love calls you cruel. If I could tell you one thing, it would be this. Don't wait until you're 71 and the checkout girl at the Kroger has to teach you who your family is. Give your children your time, your standards, your honest no. Long before you give them your money, teach them what a thing is worth and make them pay it. Hayes cried on the phone because he'd looked for me at his wedding and I wasn't there, and the only reason that story has a good ending is that he, at least, had enough of his grandmother in him to want the truth more than the comfort. I still drive past my father's old hardware store every Tuesday. I just don't sit there grieving anymore. The bolt was never free. It took me my whole life to say so out loud, and the strange thing is, the day I finally did, I stopped being a wallet and started, at last, being a grandfather.